In September 2016, the BBC announced the discovery of 2 Chinese skeletons at an ancient Roman burial site in England. Who were these people? What drove them to the far end of the world? We don't know yet, but for once, an article's clickbait headline may not be exaggerating. If we can confirm the genetic identity of these skeletons, it could indeed rewrite Roman history, as the article says, or at the very least, it could rewrite a lot of long-held assumptions about which civilizations were in contact with which others during the days of the Roman Empire. Oh, we've known for a long time that the ancient Romans were aware of China's existence. In fact, Chinese silk was such a drain on the Roman economy that the Roman Senate tried to outlaw it in the year 14, and Chinese emperors of the Han dynasty were certainly aware of Rome too. They called it Da Qin, and repeatedly tried to reach it with envoys and Buddhist missionaries. No one disputes the fact that these two cultures, China and Rome, had centuries of indirect contact via trade routes through India and Persia. In fact, Roman coins have been found as far east as Japan, and DNA evidence seems to suggest that some Europeans settled on the western fringes of China as early as the 200s BC. But what's much less clear is whether Chinese or Roman diplomats ever managed to achieve direct contact on each other's native soil. Until these Chinese skeletons were unearthed in England, at the far western end of the Roman Empire, no one had ever found any proof that a single Chinese envoy ever actually made it to Rome, or that a Roman envoy reached China, which would mean that Romans were largely locked out of the civilized world. Now wait, wasn't Rome the civilized world? Well, that's certainly what most of us are taught in school. Back in my school days, I was taught a fair amount about Rome, a tiny bit about China, and even less about Persia, and nothing at all about the Kushans or the Axumites or any of the other powerful empires that controlled large chunks of the globe and often helped shape the cultures and fortunes of European nations. The truth is, though, that Rome's Asian contemporaries completely dwarfed Rome in many respects: heritage, population density, cultural diversity, technology, architecture, medicine, poetry, philosophy. I could go on, but you get the idea. During the Roman period, the Asian continent was by far the wealthiest, most advanced, most culturally diverse region of the globe. Imperial Rome was a dim backwater by comparison. Now, who were these vast empires of Asia? What was it like to live in them? Where did they come from, and what legacies did they leave? I'm glad you asked. Let's take a journey to the east. Before we begin our tale, we need to briefly set our stage and make sure all our actors are on their marks. In the 200s to 400s AD, the range of dates during which the owners of these Chinese skeletons made their way to Roman Britain, the map looked something like this: Rome to the west, Persia in the center, and China to the east. I say the map looked something like this because a whole lot was going on during those centuries. Rome's legions were fighting fiercely for control of Gaul, modern France and Germany, Britain for Egypt and various parts of the Balkans, while a succession of emperors scrambled to hold Rome together through an endless series of famines, wars with the East, coups d'etat, refugee crises, and revolts. Meanwhile, further east, the steppe horsemen known as the Parthians lost control of Persia, which entered a great new age under the Sasanian dynasty. Meanwhile, the Han dynasty lost its grip on China, which split into powerful warring kingdoms. And in the middle, vast tracts of southern Asia were changing hands among a dozen or more competing empires, each with a rich culture of its own. Since we don't know exactly when those Chinese travelers left China and arrived in Roman Britain, it's hard to say exactly what kind of China they left, what kind of Rome they arrived in, or what kind of Persia or what other empires they had to pass through to get there. With that in mind, let's spend some time in a few of those Asian empires and get to know their people. The Sasanians could trace their cultural ancestry all the way back to the primordial mists of recorded history, to the very dawn of civilization itself. They had taken Persia from the Parthians, who'd taken it from the Seleucid Greeks, descendants of Alexander the Great, an infamous villain in Persian eyes to this very day. Alexander had ripped it from the hands of the glorious Achaemenid dynasty, who in turn had freed Mesopotamia from the brutal yoke of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. All this took place back when Rome was a mud hut village. The Assyrians, in their turn, had just been the latest in a long line of conquerors, reaching back through the Babylonians, through many long centuries, to the Akkadian Empire of Sargon the Great, the first documented multi-ethnic empire in world history, which owed its own cultural legacy to the Sumerians. By the time they met Rome, the Sasanians could look back through no less than 3,000 years of literate urban society. The oldest works of poetry and sculpture in their treasure houses were as ancient for them as the Iliad and the Odyssey are for us today. At its height, the Sasanian Empire spanned all of today's Iraq, Iran, Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Palestine, Israel, Jordan, Georgia, Armenia, and many other parts of Uzbekistan, Tajikistan, Afghanistan. Sasanian Persia was geographically smaller than the Roman Empire at its peak size, but it was far more urban, far more culturally diverse, and far more densely populated. The Sasanian Empire's subjects hailed from uncounted hundreds of tribes and peoples. They practiced at least 10 different major religions, including Judaism, Hinduism, and Buddhism, along with the late form of the religion of ancient Babylon. The state religion was Zoroastrianism, as it had been since the Achaemenid dynasty 5 centuries before, and would remain so until the coming of Islam. In fact, many practicing Zoroastrians still live in the region and around the world today. The Sasanian subject peoples spoke dozens of languages. Courtly tongues were Greek and Aramaic, along with an ancestor of the Farsi language, which is spoken in Iran to this day. At the head of the Sasanian state sat the Shah and Shah, the King of Kings, a title borrowed from Achaemenid Persian emperors like Darius and Xerxes, who derived their titles, ultimately, from royal titles used by Babylonian and Akkadian conquerors thousands of years before them. Below the Shah and Shah, a meticulously organized pyramid of governors and viziers extended down to the powerful nobility of land-holding feudal aristocrats who oversaw middle classes of priests, warriors, commoners, and artisans. At the bottom of this grand period were slaves, mostly household servants who were treated relatively mildly for the period. Harming a slave was a crime, forbidden even to the Shah and Shah himself. The upper classes enjoyed the first recognizably Persian culture: brocaded silks, floral tapestries, ornate goblets, sumptuous carpets, intricate mosaics, and the styles of music, food, and poetry that would captivate their Islamic conquerors a few centuries in the future. In fact, this same culture would captivate the Seljuk Turks, the Mongols, and the Ottomans, and would continue to lend its distinct influences to Turkey and Iran to this very day. Anytime you savor a bite of baklava or sip a glass of dark Turkish tea, it's the Sasanians you have to thank. You can also thank the Sasanian aristocracy for much of what would later become the medieval European aesthetic. Look at this Sasanian rock engraving, for example, and you're essentially looking at a medieval European king there on the right. But that's no European king. That's the Sasanian Shah and Shah Shapur I, and that engraving dates from the year 260, a full 1,000 years before the height of the European Middle Ages. At that time, the height of Roman fashions was still togas and sandals. Like the Emperor Shapur, time traveled to Rome from the future. The Sasanian aristocracy, like their later European medieval imitators, wore ankle-length robes and pointed slippers, tunics, and trousers, which they had borrowed from the Achaemenids, the Assyrians, and the Babylonians before them. Sasanian knights rode into battle on famously huge horses, outfitted in full suits of chainmail armor, wielding broadswords and longbows, carrying jousting lances. Ever wondered how Roman legions would fare against medieval knights? You don't have to wonder. The Romans fought hundreds of battles against the Sasanians, who often beat the Roman legions to a bloody pulp, especially when fighting on the defenses. By the time the Roman army started incorporating their own armored heavy cavalry, they got better at fighting back against the feudal knights of the Sasanian aristocracy. But the Romans never made any permanent incursions into Sasanian territory, or inflicted many serious defeats on the Sasanian knights. The Sasanians Sasanians never made it very far into Roman territory either. For hundreds of years, the two empires held each other at a stalemate. It wasn't only in military matters that the Sasanians were centuries ahead of their time. Their scholars translated the works of Plato and Aristotle, preserving many books that were later lost to the West. And they organized debates between sages and scholars of philosophies and religions from all across Europe and Asia. The Shah and Shah established a grand school at the capital city of Ctesiphon in modern Iraq, where more than 30,000 pupils studied astronomy, architecture, medicine, and literature under the world's masters of these disciplines. In fact, a few centuries later, when the Roman Emperor Justinian forcibly closed all the Greek philosophical schools, the Sasanians welcomed the fleeing Greek philosophers with open arms and added to their cultural riches. An empire like the Sasanians doesn't collapse easily. Long after the Western Roman Empire fell beneath waves of attack from the Huns and Goths, the Sasanian empires were still holding their own against Eastern Roman Empire, yet they were slowly growing weaker under relentless losses from the Byzantines, the Turks, the Khazars, and hordes of other enemies. By the time the armies of Islam rode out of the deserts of Arabia, the once great Sasanian Empire was fragmented and exhausted. An Islamic army led by Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab captured city after Sasanian city throughout the mid-600s, and by the year 651, the remains of the knightly and priestly aristocracy fled in despair into the vastness of the Central Asian steppeland. It's often been said, though, that no one truly captures Persia, because Persia captures her conquerors. There's no doubt that she captured the Arabs. Much of what we think of as Arabian culture today, the distinctive styles of art, food, architecture, and music, the tales of the 1001 Nights, the wealth and opulence of Middle Eastern monarchs, owes far more to the Sasanian palace gardens than to the bleak deserts of Arabia. And yet, the Sasanians themselves had, in the same way, been captured by cultures far older than their own. The culture of Babylon, Akkad, and Sumer, which had flourished in the cradle of civilization since time immemorial. These Knights of the Silk Road, then, were only the latest in a long line of gatekeepers who held the keys to the Garden of Eden. The Yuezhi had once been a confederation of horse steppe tribes raiding along the borders of territory controlled by China's Han dynasty, when a more powerful tribe known as the Xiongnu, who may have been related to the Huns who later threatened Rome, defeated the Yuezhi. The confederation of horse tribes split up, each group riding outwards in its own direction, some north into what's now Russia, others west, skirting along the eastern borders of Persia, still others down into today's Pakistan and Afghanistan. It was this last tribe of Yuezhi, the ones who headed south, who managed to weld all the neighboring Yuezhi tribes into a tightly organized military machine and began to seize control of the rich river valleys they found. The territory they conquered, beginning in what's now Afghanistan, was far from unoccupied. In fact, it was held by descendants of Alexander the Great, who had wrenched it from the Achaemenid Persians about 300 years earlier. These forested valleys were still filled with Greek cities, many of them now inhabited by the Scythians, another tribe of fierce Indo-Iranian horse people, whose own warrior culture wasn't too different from that of the invading Yuezhi. All the same, the Yuezhi quickly kicked out the Scythians and assimilated them into a culture forged from Greek, Persian, and Arabian influences. In fact, some of the Greek cities in the Peshawar Valley were still inhabited by their Greek conquerors, who introduced the Yuezhi to the Greek language and alphabet, along with Greek coinage, religion, and philosophy. It's somewhere around this time, it's hard to say exactly when, because the tradition was mainly oral, and they left few written records. The Yuezhi began styling themselves Kushan, or Wuishang to the Chinese. No one's sure where this name came from, but it soon became widely known as Kushan armies swept westward and southward down through Pakistan and into northern India, cheerfully assimilating new languages, clothes, technologies, and religious faiths every step of the way. At the time, no one had the power to stop them. The Scythian tribes were warring incessantly among themselves. Their petty chiefdoms collapsed before the Kushan onslaught. Far to the east, meanwhile, the Han Chinese were tied up with their own border struggles against the Xiongnu and other steppe tribes. Persia, meanwhile, was under the thumb of the Parthian dynasty, who were also a horse people from the steppes, with a stern warrior culture closely related to the Kushan's own, and to that of the Scythians, who the Kushans had kicked out. The Parthians and the Kushans, however, seem to have been evenly matched enough that they tried to stay out of each other's way. For the Kushans, this setup was almost too good to be true. By the 200s AD, their warrior aristocracy had piled up wealth beyond their wildest dreams. They were dressing like Persians, speaking like Greeks, trading actively with Rome and China, and practicing an easygoing mixture of Zoroastrianism, Buddhism, Hinduism, and Greco-Roman polytheism. Kushan kings lived in splendor amidst art and architecture that freely combined Greek, Persian, Chinese, and Indian influences. Some of the Kushan kings seem to have taken Greek throne names. Others, meanwhile, took Indian or Persian ones. See if you can spot the Kushan in this image. He's the one on the left, like he's saying, Day 65. The Buddhist monks have accepted me as one of their own. I sometimes wonder if it's this melting pot nature of the Kushan Empire, combined with their relative lack of written records, that's consigned them to the neglected back alleys of history. What I mean is, it's easy to point to a temple and say, well, that's Greek architecture, or to look at a silk carpet and say, well, that's clearly Chinese. But the Kushans seem to have been content to trade, prosper, and delight in the culture of everyone around them, without leaving behind much of anything that was uniquely their own. And to be honest, it's hard to blame them. These homespun horsefolk, fleeing the harshness of the steppe, landed smack dab in the middle of one of the richest cultural whirlpools the world had ever seen. They had Greek philosophers, Roman architects, Persian poets, Indian musicians, and Chinese trade routes, thousands of years of collective cultural experience right at their fingertips. Maybe they knew better than to try to fix a system that clearly wasn't broken. And yet, the Kushan Empire always found itself pulled in divergent directions. They managed to hold their western frontiers for 2 centuries against the Parthian rulers of Persia, but once the Sasanian dynasty seized control and started probing east, the Kushans began to lose western territory faster than they could recover it. When the Kushan king Vasudeva I died in 225 AD, the empire split into eastern and western halves, each of which was just too ripe and vulnerable for its neighbors to resist. Those high-powered Sasanian knights thundered through the western Kushan territories, snatching up wealthy cities by the bucketload, barely even breaking a sweat. The eastern Kushan Empire, meanwhile, dissolved into near anarchy for a century, as small dynasties like the Yodhayas battled fellow Kushans, petty warlords, invading steppe nomads, and a rising local power known as the Guptas. And it was this last empire that finally finished off the eastern Kushans around the year 320, and it's with them, the Guptas, that our tale enters its next chapter. Ask any group of people what constitutes their culture's golden age, and you'll get a different answer. For some British people, it might be the Victorian era. For Italians, maybe the Renaissance or the Roman Empire. For the Chinese, probably the Han or Tang dynasty. In India, it's the Gupta period, which undeniably counts as a golden age, not only for northern India, but as one of the world's all-time greatest cultural flowerings, comparable in ambition and influence to the golden age blossomings of Babylon and Athens. For an empire of such splendor and significance, the Guptas have left us remarkably little information about their own origins. Scholars agree that the Guptas descended from people who had been living in India for some time, but beyond that, scholarly opinions diverge, and widely. Some say the Guptas were a local caste who rose up against oppressive rulers. Others say they came from further south, conquering as they progressed northwards. In fact, we don't even have exact dates for the reigns of the first few Gupta kings. What we do know for certain is that by the year 320, a Gupta monarch named Chandragupta I consolidated his alliances and resources around the city of Pataliputra, known today as modern Patna in the Indian state of Bihar, and Chandragupta proceeded to conquer almost all of the northern Ganges River Valley. Over the next 100 years, a line of energetic Gupta kings expanded their empire across all of northern India, along with large swaths of modern Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Nepal. While this was geographically a small empire, it proved to be intensely vibrant. The Sanskrit-speaking Gupta kings divided their empire into 36 provinces, set up a strict hierarchy of administrators and bureaucrats, established trade links with Rome, Persia, and China, and created what can only be described as one of the most astonishing cultures in all world history. A major reason why Gupta culture is so surprising, especially as a contemporary of the ancient Roman Empire, is that its rulers and administrators organized their world in terms that seem strikingly modern, even to us today. For example, throughout the 300s and 400s, Gupta kings instituted urban zoning laws, planted their cities with public gardens of trees and flowers, and actively worked to raise the common people's standard of living. They outlawed torture and capital punishment, which was unheard of at that time anywhere in the world, and established an explicit policy of tolerance and acceptance toward all religious faiths. Perhaps it wasn't altogether novel even in the Gupta period. The Gupta kings, after all, were heirs to a cultural tradition that reached back as far as that of the Persians and Babylonians. At Bronze Age sites like Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, which date all the way back to the 2000s BC, Indian contemporaries of the Sumerians constructed planned cities with organized linear grids of paved roads and sewers. They may have even begun to develop yoga. 500 years or so before the Guptas, around the time of the Golden Age of Athens in Greece, the Buddhist emperor Ashoka of the Mauryan dynasty had imposed a royal ban on the killing of animals, revised the judicial code to ensure due process for prisoners, and endowed traveling doctors and roadside facilities to treat the sick throughout his empire. That ancient emperor Ashoka publicly declared his respect for all religious faiths and invited teachers of all religions to come exchange ideas in that same capital city of Pataliputra. He sent Buddhist missionaries to China and Persia and tried to send some to Europe, though it's unclear if any of them ever made it that far. Influenced by this ancient king Ashoka's example, the Guptas, contemporaries of the Romans, publicly sponsored roadside inns, orphanages, and hospitals, and donated large sums of money to philanthropic causes, particularly in medicine and education. They went so far as to set up public schools where anyone could come and study ancient literature. And if this all sounds like Gupta propaganda, it's worth noting that even visiting Chinese monks like Fa Xian and Xuanzang expressed amazement at the law and order of Gupta cities, at the literacy and refinement and cleanliness of Gupta people, and at the fact that any ordinary Gupta citizen could walk the streets safely, any time of the day or night. Gupta kings commissioned entire libraries worth of books, plays, poems, and songs that are still widely enjoyed in India to this day. Gupta mathematicians invented the mathematical concept of zero, and created the base 10 positional numeral system we use today. Gupta astronomers proposed that the Earth was round, rotated on its own axis, and orbited the sun. Gupta doctors invented new medical instruments and performed surgeries with local anesthetic. In the military, the Gupta were no less impressive. They had cavalry, elephants, and chariotry, which inspired the invention of the game of chess. They were one of the best armed and most tightly organized militaries of their time. In fact, their discipline was legendary among their Chinese and Persian contemporaries, and their troops always seemed to arrive well-fed and fully supplied with Gupta steel that was so finely forged it was said to be immune to rust, highly prized as a treasure all across Asia. Yet although the Guptas were famous for their military organization, not to mention their war elephants and fire arrows, they never showed much interest in adopting the cavalry tactics that proved so successful for their Sasanian neighbors. Maybe they didn't have to. Much of their territory was comprised of dense jungles and valleys, where elephants and infantry were much more effective than broad cavalry charges. And yet despite all this, the Gupta Empire finally did collapse in the late 470s, almost exactly the same time that Rome was falling to the Goths. The Guptas, however, didn't fall at the hands of any single enemy, but under ceaseless waves of attacks from all directions. They battled the Huns and actually managed to drive them out, unlike the Romans, and they succeeded in driving another confederation known as the Hephthalites, who broke in from the northwest. Meanwhile, another neighboring empire, that of the Alikara dynasty of Malwa, who had been the Guptas' staunch ally against the Huns just a decade before, began to make their own grabs for the rich cities of Gupta territory. Another competing empire, that of the Vakatakas, was rising in the south. It was all too much, too many attacks from too many directions all at once. Sources are unclear about exactly what happened, but we know that by the year 500, the Guptas had been driven out of northern India, and their beautifully organized empire was no more. But in many ways, though, Gupta culture never really died. Quite a few forms of classical Gupta music come directly from this period, as do many styles of literature, clothing, words, traditions, and holidays still celebrated in India to this very day. Even we in the West owe the Guptas for the game of chess, the number 0, our quote-unquote Arabic numeral system, which is in fact Indian, and for the Kama Sutra, to name just a few things, across 2 continents and nearly 2,000 years of history. Imagine if you could visit Rome today and find it still populated by Latin-speaking, toga-wearing Romans. Or if you could go to modern-day Iraq and still find the ziggurats and hanging gardens of Babylon still standing. That's essentially what China was like for about 3,000 years straight. The Zhao dynasty in the thousands BC were largely responsible for this incredible cultural consistency. The Zhao introduced two concepts that would change China all the way down to the Maoist revolution of 1949 and beyond. The first of these two core concepts was that of the mandate of heaven. The Zhao sages taught that it was heaven itself, not the whims of fate and ambitions of individual men and women, but the fundamental order of the universe that decreed how long each dynasty and emperor would rule China. When heaven grew displeased with a corrupt ruler or dynasty, heaven sent an army or an assassin to eliminate them. When heaven wanted a new dynasty on the throne, heaven put them there, whether they were of noble birth or not. It was not the role of mere mortals, the Chinese sages believed, to question heaven's will. And so when one dynasty fell and another replaced it, this was not seen as a revolution, but merely as the passing of the mandate of heaven from one chosen set of rulers to the next. The second crucial concept introduced by the Zhao, which was paired tightly with the mandate of heaven, was that cultural variation was a sign of low breeding and was to be avoided at all costs, particularly by the aristocracy. In other words, not only did the sages teach that heaven approved of certain rulers and dynasties, but that heaven preferred specific styles of art, architecture, clothing, and music. Aristocrats and artists who diverged from heaven's aesthetic taste were likely to find themselves on the bad side of heaven and kicked off the throne. And thus, even when a new set of rulers seized power, even when China split into warring kingdoms, as it did many times throughout its history, in fact, even when invading alien peoples swept in and took over Chinese cities, every single one of those conquerors followed the protocol of transferring the mandate of heaven to themselves and scrupulously observing the Zhao rules of artistic aesthetics, dress, music, and courtly etiquette. Around 500 BC, a philosopher and statesman known as Kung Fuzi, Master Kung, known better in the West as Confucius, codified these heavenly rules into a series of texts which would form the backbone of Chinese culture for the next 2,000 years. Master Kung's intricate philosophy, known in the West as Confucianism, utterly permeated every area of Chinese existence, from statecraft to family life, to etiquette, to martial arts, to dress, to music, to architecture. Everyone in China, from the highest nobility to the lowest peasants, was raised on Master Kung's principles. In fact, many people in China still study and live by his maxims to this very day. Master Kung's cultural codes are the reason why you can look at a Qin dynasty temple from the 200s BC, look at a Song dynasty painting from the 1200s AD, and scan a text written anytime from the ancient Zhao period all the way to the modern People's Republic of China, and easily recognize all of them as aesthetically Chinese. There is simply no Western equivalent for this level of cultural continuity. Sure, our alphabet is based on the Greek and Roman alphabets, and we speak languages derived from ancient European ones, but we don't still identify as citizens of the Roman Empire or believe in the gods of Mount Olympus. Neither do most Chinese people today literally believe in the mandate of heaven, but in the time of the Roman Empire, the people of the Han Dynasty considered themselves the proud heirs of a culture with more than 1,000 years of unbroken recorded history. And they would continue to observe the mandate of heaven and follow the Confucian rules with only minor variations, all the way up to the overthrow of the monarchy more than 1,000 years later in the 1900s. The mandate of heaven, the sages said, had first descended when the Zhao dynasty seized power from the corrupt Shang, roughly 300 years before the founding of Rome, in about the year 1046 BC. This was the official beginning of the state of Qin, which would someday be known in the West as China. The recorded history of this region, however, reaches back long before the state of Qin. Inscriptions on oracle bones, in a language recognizably related to modern Mandarin Chinese, date back at least to the 1500s BC, the golden age of ancient Babylon. Tradition holds that the very first ethnically Chinese dynasty was that of the Xia in the 2100s BC. Scholars long regarded this as a mythical tale until 1959, when excavations in Henan province unearthed artifacts and texts that were carbon dated to this age range. This means that Chinese civilization is about as old as the Egyptian pyramids. After the Shang and Zhao dynasties had come the Qin dynasty, whose founder Qin Shi Huangdi was the first person to proclaim himself Emperor of China. He burned thousands of dissident books, executed thousands of philosophers and scholars who disagreed with him, joined a string of walls along China's western border into the Great Wall, and expanded his realm to encompass most of what's now central and southern China. He died in the year 221 BC, frantically searching for an elixir of immortality, and was buried with his famous terracotta army. Meanwhile, far to the west, Alexander the Great's descendants were warring for the remains of the Seleucid Empire, which stretched from modern-day Greece to Afghanistan. The Roman Republic was beginning to make its name as a small regional player on the Italian peninsula. But when the Mandate of Heaven passed from the Qin dynasty to the Han, the Chinese cared little for the squabbles of Western barbarians. Their main concerns were the vast tribes of steppe horsemen like the Xiongnu, who were constantly nipping at their borders, and the delicate political balance between the capital and the feudal kings who controlled other areas of the land. China was, at that time, the wealthiest, most technologically advanced, most densely populated region in the world, by far. The Han capital of Chang'an, perpetual peace, was organized along a grid of rectangles, the royal palace at its head, and each street zoned for specific types of buildings. An army of civil servants, each of them recommended by a patron, promoted strictly on merit, produced a wealth of forms and reports along remarkably consistent templates. These documents give us an almost unbelievable level of detailed insight into the daily lives of people in Han China. At the apex of society sat the emperor, a personage so august that it was blasphemous to address him by name. Courtiers instead used titles like "under the steps to the throne." The punishment for entering the palace without permission was execution, and even people permitted inside could only progress so far, according to rank and the emperor's whim, through a series of concentric rings of increasing opulence, until at last, if they were truly blessed by heaven's favor, they might enter the throne room itself, where the superior one sat at the center of all creation, orbited by swarms of minor kings, nobles, bureaucrats, scholars, eunuchs, concubines, and slaves. It's unclear whether the Persians imported this type of court from China or drew on Babylonian traditions closer to home. Probably both. But by the time of the Sasanian emperors and their Roman contemporaries, the Persian court was heavily influenced by the awe and mystery of Chang'an. In fact, it was this sense of overpowering august majesty, concentric rings of access, worshipful titles of address, precise and subtle rules of courtly etiquette that would later influence the courts of the Byzantine and Ottoman emperors. Through them, indirectly, echoes of Chang'an would someday reverberate in the court of Louis XIV in France in the 1600s. The palace complex of Versailles is, in its way, one of the last dim shadows of the Han imperial court. But all that, of course, still lay more than 1,000 years in the future. As the Roman Emperor Diocletian was rising to power in the West, the Han Chinese were churning out popular novels and poetry collections with printing presses, tracking earthquakes with seismographs, and running bamboo gas pipelines through the earth to fuel furnaces in their houses and palaces. They were directing their armies with odometers and compasses, developing mathematical matrices and linear equations, mapping their country on a graduated scale grid system, exploring the high seas in great ships, analyzing the water cycle and re-engineering their crops, and developing the techniques of acupuncture. No other civilization in the world would experience anything remotely like this level of advancement until the golden age of Baghdad in the 900s. Most of Europe would have to wait until the Renaissance in the 1400s or later to reach the same level of technology that the Han Chinese enjoyed in the 200s BC. Han Dynasty craftsmanship was the most prized along the entire Silk Road, imitated by many other Asian cultures, but never duplicated. Chinese silk was, of course, highly valued from India all the way to Rome. Even when silkworms could be smuggled out of China, the penalty for this was death. The skills of Persian and Indian artisans were no match for the mastery of Chinese silk weavers, who knew the secret of producing intricate woven patterns not only on one side of the fabric, but on both sides simultaneously. Han ceramics, steel, and jade work fetched such outrageous prices in the West that merchants would gladly risk their lives for a shot at the profits. In an age when most texts were written on wood or animal skin, the Han were pressing and printing paper, which was saved and stockpiled throughout Asia, giving us centuries of ink-written documentation on the daily lives not only of the Han themselves, but also of their trading partners. The Han army was said to number in the millions, which is almost certainly an exaggeration. But we do know from Han records that every male commoner aged 23 or older, in a population of 58 million, was liable for conscription into the infantry, cavalry, or navy. The army was every bit as tightly organized as those of the Guptas and Romans, divided into regiments, companies, and platoons. Although the peasants might might mainly serve on the front lines as arrow fodder, the Han also maintained a standing army of thoroughly drilled and disciplined core troops, ready to serve as the backbone of any heavy fight. Their swordsmen were armed with legendarily strong Han steel, the archers with crossbows, the cavalry with lances and stirruped saddles. Han military commanders were just as thoroughly trained and well-read as the civil servants in every other field of the Han dynasty, informed by tactical manuals like Sun Tzu's The Art of War, which was already a 600-year-old classic in the Han periods, and sharpened against relentless assaults of horse archers from the steppes. The Han army represented the peak of ancient Chinese military expertise. It's tempting to wonder how a battle between Han Chinese archers and Roman imperial legions might have played out. We'll never know because such a war never happened, although it is just possible that a lost Roman legion once battled a Chinese force in Kazakhstan, a story for another day. On the whole, however, northern China's sprawling steppe lands served as a continent-spanning buffer zone between the Chinese and their nearest neighbors, a void where empires like the Scythians and the Sogdians would take root and carve out their own territories. While Chinese monks and merchants were in active contact with the Kushans, the Guptas, the Parthians, the Sasanians, and now it seems perhaps even with the Roman Empire, the Han shared no large immediate borders with any of these empires. Their enemies, from the most ancient times onward, came from the wilds of the steppe or from inside China itself. It was those internal enemies who finally ripped the Han Empire apart in 220 AD, setting off the Three Kingdoms period, after which the Mandate of Heaven passed to the Jin dynasty, who ruled until just before the fall of the Western Roman Empire. So depending on when exactly the owners of these Chinese skeletons left China, they may have departed from the Han Empire, from one of the Three Kingdoms, or from the Empire of the Jin. Whatever the case, it would have made very little difference in terms of the language, the architecture, the technology, and the luxuries they left behind. Like the Han and the dynasties before them, the rulers of the Three Kingdoms piously accepted the Mandate of Heaven and governed their lands according to Confucius principles, as did the Jin after them. In fact, modern Chang'an is now called Xi'an and is built atop the ruins of that same ancient city, based on the same type of rectangular grid layout created by the Han dynasty. By the time the Huns, and later invaders like the Mongols and the Turks, arrived at Rome's eastern frontiers, they or their close relatives had already survived battles against the armies of the Chinese, the Persians, the Kushans, the Guptas, civilizations with thousands of years of tactical tradition and the most advanced weaponry of their age. For those Hunnic invaders, as for most Asians of that time, Europe was almost too small and insignificant to be beneath serious notice. The steppe tribes wanted it mainly for grazing land for their horses. Because as any Asian horseman or merchant could easily see, not even the wealthiest European city held a candle to Ctesiphon or Pataliputra or Chang'an. The West was a dark forest haunted by primitive tribes, the Romans only scarcely cleaner and more civilized than the rest of them. In the book Heart of Darkness, the narrator Marlowe says, "This too has been one of the dark places of the earth." The dark continent he's talking about is none other than England. Who can say what went through the heads of those Chinese travelers, whoever they were, as they departed from the light and life of the civilized world, setting off on their journey into the savage darkness of the West? Who can guess what they felt at the end of their lives, realizing they would die in Roman Britain, a wilderness at the far end of the world? Or what drove them there in the first place? What about you? If you had grown up in one of those great Asian cities, would you have been brave enough to depart for the darkness, or would you, like so many millions of others, have thanked the heavens that you were born into the light?